Great, thanks, Thomas. Hi, everybody. Um, Thomas asked me to talk explicitly about my PhD, but I think in the context of a conference that is explicitly to do with practice, I think it's really important to reflect on how making has underpinned my practice. And I'll kind of weave in and out of the space between academia and practice as much as I will the space between designing and making. And in a way, I'm also going to talk about, what goes wrong and the kind of struggles of practice, because in many ways, my roadmap isn't a template for others to use. But I think, if anything, we can learn mistakes. And, I've got a very scrappy body of work. And in many ways, I'm rather ashamed of it when I look at what other people are doing. And I think, I'm kind of buried away in the woods here, scratching a few sticks together. And I'm always astonished when it sort of feels like practice or even feels like architecture. But I fell into practice originally by building my own house. And I, in a way, I never thought I would, never particularly wanted to have my own practice. And I would have been quite happy working for a relatively mainstream big practice, or at least that's what I thought I would, and I just assumed I would work for Field and Clegg Bradley, but they never gave me a job. And I think I applied 5 times, and each time they firmly dismissed me. So I was sort of forced just by circumstance to set up a practice, because I lived in a rural part of the southwest of the United Kingdom, and I had kids very young and couldn't afford to live in London. And, I didn't really have a rural practice. That's one of the things I do want to say. And I'm incredibly suspicious of architects when they talk about the rural as a condition, as a thing, as if we're in sort of pre-industrial Britain. And of course, I think I work everywhere and kind of nowhere. So either way, I fell into practice through building my own house. And the interesting thing about making was that this had nothing to do with making. So when I made the house, in a way, I made it in the most dumb way possible, in that I pre-imagined something and I made it. So the making, the craft of the building was in some ways irrelevant. But what it gave me was an incredible freedom to cut out the middleman, to work as if I was a musician, just recording my own music. And one of the things about architecture is that we're so terribly dependent on that other third party to give us work. And what bothers me is that that's such a kind of disempowering relationship. We always depend on other people. And one of the things I've kind of wanted to do over the last 20 years is find ways of initiating our own work. So we built the house and we then rebuilt the house. But what I suppose was most interesting when I was building the house was that I wanted I wanted to understand that if I was going to bother to make, what could it give me? Because of course I was a terrible maker and I'm not a contractor. And I wanted to really understand how I could benefit from this thing if I was going to do it. And it's really hard work making. So what is it that making can give us if it isn't just being a contractor, or even just effectively equivalently recording our own music? So we loosely started this thing called Studio in the Woods about 15 or 16 years ago. And what was interesting about this thing was that we didn't really start it. We just kind of got together with a kind of hunger to make stuff, because we all know that when you're in architecture school, you don't make buildings, you make approximations of buildings. You make a kind of weird code space of a building in a representation, in a model, in a computer. And so what was really important for us, that we could get together to make real buildings and make them incredibly quickly as part of a sort of community of people who are interested and greedy to build. And one of the things I've always been is kind of greedy to build. I've been hungry to build, even in those times when I've had very little work. So in some ways, this was Studio in the Woods as was and when we started. And again, through all the years that we were doing Studio in the Woods, one of the questions was still, for me, this thing that we're doing is interesting, but how can it really change the way that we think about designing buildings? And are we still guilty in some ways of designing buildings as if making was something that other people would do, i.e. what's different about these buildings because we make them, and we're making them, not other people? So it was doing a project with two projects with Charlie Brentnell, who's going to talk later, that really changed the course of how I think about making, and also what it could give my architecture, and how it could free me from the sort of tyranny of pre-imagining work that other people would build via a set of sort of contract documents where everything was pre-prescribed in the most extraordinary amount of detail. Something slightly going on with the clicker here, but I'm trying to get to a project which set in train a course of change for me as an architect. So this was all Studio in the Woods as was, and it's kind of doing what architects do. They get together, they kind of pre-imagine shapes, and they find materials. They talk about materiality in a kind of vaguely non-specific way, and then they make stuff. So we did two projects down in Dartmoor for Tom Randall Page's father's summer school. Pete Randall Page organized something called Spatial Structures. And the first year that we did it, we made a piece where we just kind of did what I already knew. And I was guilty of kind of carrying on with this conceit that we would fit a shape to an idea. So we had this idea that you could be suspended over the river, and then we would go in a patch of light under a canopy, kind of phenomenological things that we would then fit some kind of structure to. And when we were doing this, I kind of was aware that the construction of this thing was so interesting. Why wasn't that part of the piece? Why did we do all this stuff? And then it disappeared. And then we had a kind of static, this could be, although it's made out of wood, this could be a kind of Farnsworth house. It's a modernist pavilion that sits there in landscape that we experience as a kind of little piece of quasi-modernism. And I felt pleased that I'd built something, but on the other hand, curious as to know what else could making give us to really empower us. So the next year changed everything for me. And we went down there and we started by doing what people would conventionally do. We worked out where we needed to place someone in landscape to have a particular experience of that landscape. The oldest and most obvious sort of architectural move, this was, and then we sat in a workshop and then we worked out what shape this thing needed to be. And then, we went out and were directed by a skilled maker who was, of course, Charlie Brentnell, and we made this thing. But as I, in my absurd architectural impotence, began to step back and allow kind of serious people to do interesting things, I realized that this stuff that was unfolding in front of me, that was directed by Charlie, that would happen and then go away and then leave the architecture at the end of it, in a way was done a disservice by the architecture, because this thing at the end of it wasn't nearly as interesting as the thing that Charlie had choreographed. So the next year when we made with a view to really understanding how that choreography of people through the embodied experience of making could be the thing that defined the architecture. So every other project that I've ever done in Studio in the Woods since that year, and this was Isle of Wight, I don't know, however many years ago, was defined by not pre-designing something that we think about in our heads, we talk about, we then act out on some kind of inert material in the most dumb kind of Renaissance way. So what we did was use the embodied experience of making and the language of construction to set out a series of points in space that then made manifest that. So this was something that we could only design through making. We couldn't pre-imagine these relationships. It has a very particular making. So I understood that selfishly, as a designer, making was something that would allow me to imagine a different type of artifact. So all of my teaching since then has been about how can the process of making itself allow us to discover a different manner of artifacts. So all of the stuff that we do with students is using their own experience of making as design. So we talk about making a lot, but making as design is what I'm most interested in. And that means we don't use words, we don't use language, we use the embodied experience of making itself to configure artifacts, where all of these relationships can't ever be pre-defined. design. They happen, they come into life, they come into being through actually the embodied description, the embodied experience of using our hands and our bodies to make something, which we as designers then judge in real time as it is emerging in front of us. So we accept, we in a way surrender to the risk of these things as they are happening. We don't know if they're going to be any good, but we trust that we can catch them and judge them and choreograph them as they are happening in front of us in real time as we do that. So in some ways, although these are kind of student projects, the question will be, how do we then do that in proper big buildings? So some years back, I was asked to get involved in the AA program, the Design and Make program. And although, you know, in a way, this was an amazing project, and it was an amazing project because we got to realize and we got to build something that was unusual and interesting, and in some ways was a kind of clever piece of construction. But what was really fascinating, I think, for me as a designer was that I felt still we were perpetuating a set of conventions that I couldn't escape from. So we could do this stuff at Studio in the Woods, but when we came to do buildings, we would pre-design it. We would draw every single manner of every single component in an office somewhere else, somewhere remote. Every single condition here, we would predetermine, pre-design, pre-imagine. So the process of making as a designer brought me nothing. Other people might have got something out of it. So Charlie built this with students very well, very beautifully. And I'm sure Charlie got something out of it. But as a designer, I got nothing from the process of making this. It could have been a dumb white pavilion that we pre-imagined every tiny piece of it. And in many ways, that was my frustration with this building. And in a way, I've been highly critical of this building in my PhD as a sort of, as a perpetuating, supposedly within an avant-garde school of architecture, perpetuating the most obvious set of relationships that we were enthralled to, that we couldn't ever escape. So almost everything that I've done since then has, again, in my buildings, been asking this question: how do we not do that for greater or lesser? In a way, so I left there to focus on the work that I was doing in my own woodland. And one of the things I have done is when I haven't been busy, I've just built buildings alongside other things. And in a way, it's part of that thing that I've talked about. It's been the greed and the hunger to build. And the most important thing to me as a practitioner is still building, is realizing spatially, you know, pieces of building. So the building that we built in our own woods that I'm sitting in now was a building that we built with people who didn't know they were doing architecture. And we built it with materials that came directly from the site with the most minimal of processing, not because I cared about the look of those materials, but because I wanted to use them in the most direct and most straightforward manner. And when we did the drawings, we didn't pre-draw everything. We drew everything on one blackboard with one piece of chalk that came out of one conversation that we then used to define every aspect of this building. So every single thing about this building is described on this drawing. And of course, there aren't any dimensions because the building doesn't need dimensions. It was set out through the embodied experience of taking the timber we had, laying it on the ground, and using that first frame that we made by eye as all of the frames for the subsequent pieces that we made. And of course, we were working with people that had never built a building before. So we built using techniques that they could use that didn't require on specialist skill, that meant all of us could come together regardless of our cultural baggage and our cultural knowledge and imagine this building together. And all the mistakes that we would make would go into this building, and instead of being banished and people coming to look at it like the Wood Awards did for the big shed and say what a pity, we could see how in a building like this, in theory, the mistakes are part of the building. And that makes me far happier, although this building is of course deeply flawed, and of course it isn't even really architecture. It's a little shed in the woodland. What it sets out is the beginning of an idea about how architecture can allow the hand of the maker, the hand of the amateur, to come into the building. It allows us to understand what we can do if we don't draw every aspect of a building. It allows to understand what relationship we can have with materials, where we understand that materials aren't infinite, that they're part of a finite set of resources from an incredibly fragile ecosystem. And architecture isn't this thing of imagining shapes, of course, as we all know, in this great community of architecture, imagining shapes and then working working out how many materials we need to make it. It's taking the fewest materials we can from a place and using them in a way that kind of makes sense. So the building is unfinished because we didn't have enough materials to finish it. So we had to work out other ways of finishing the building. And of course, as I've said, you know, the building was made with unskilled labor, so everything had to fit between everything else. And I didn't want to hire expensive scaffolding. So they made the scaffolding, and the scaffolding came the furniture and became the tables and became the floors. So it was the kind of zero waste building that set out an idea. We can begin to think about making buildings in a different manner. And this is the building that we still work in, and it's the building that we built for about a year's rent from my own studio. And one of the critical things for me in practice was that I wanted to be able to operate with no overheads and no employees. And I meant that I wanted to be able to only do the work that we wanted to do, not the work that we had to do to pay any rent. So the next little building we did was a zero waste building that we just built the tiny little compost toilet with some materials that were trash materials lying around that we built again to explain that you could build, even if you almost had nothing, you could build. And of course, the conceit here is that we had the land. But even so, as an architect, I wanted to be able to make my own stuff as a way of testing ideas and not wait for a client to come along. And I didn't want to do back extensions. I wanted to do something else. So I would rather, in a way, live frugally and make frugally than do other people's work that I didn't want to do. And all of this was building to a way of understanding and thinking about how there really could be a relationship with material that could inform architecture. So the next two buildings that we did here set out an idea for a set of buildings that were called equivalent buildings, where again, we just took out materials that were part of a woodland management plan that was the most low-grade spruce, the most low-grade cedar, and we didn't know what we were going to build. So we set out a set of buildings that could just use equivalent sections of timber, an equivalent in homage to Carl Andre, who made his lovely piece Equivalent 8, of course. Thomas, if I'm going on too long, stop, because I realize this talk might be too long, but irrespective.
It's fascinating.
I'm going to carry on until you tell me to stop.
About 8 minutes, so that's
okay, good. So what we were developing was a way of doing buildings in a different manner. So this became my office, effectively. These people who I didn't employ were my neighbors in this woodland who were equally invested in understanding what we could do with this material. They weren't architects. They didn't even really know what the word architecture means. They didn't really know what making meant. They were just interested in doing the type of stuff that you can do if you have a bit of space in contexts like this. So you can see the next building there laid out on the ground, and it was made up out of 5x2 in the knowledge that in contexts like this, you can make anything out of a set of 5x2 kit of parts. And I like that if you just use one material, there's far less wastage. So this was a tiny little workshop we made that is now full of my actual machinery. And this was made again, like all of the buildings that we've made here, just with diggers that we hire typically at Christmas time or Easter time, when you can hire them and get them for 2 weeks when you just pay for 2 days. And all of the buildings that we've done here have been designed around using diggers. So the ghost barn was the first one. The second one was the little trailer that we built in exactly the same manner. It was a kit of parts, 5x2, first frame laid up over the second frame, third frame laid up over that. Agricultural fabricators making non-specialist kits of parts we then used to tow the materials down, re-erect it, and then setting out a very simple idea about how you can build frugally with ordinary, the most basic of materials like blue plastic rope and shuttering ply. And this is where my daughter's lived for 3 years with her boyfriend, because of course, like everyone their age, they can't afford to buy a house. In a way, spatially, it's kind of interesting that this is a tiny building, but it actually gives them spatially quite a lot of internal volume. So this was trailer. But the question, of course, is how does that fit into bigger projects that we still need to earn a living to do? And these buildings don't pay, whereas these buildings, in a way, pay a little bit. And this is the most mainstream of contexts. It's a government agency. It's the Forestry Commission, who you have to jump through the most obvious of kind of OJU type hoops to pre-qualify for work. And we won this project about 7 or 8 years ago. And it is a project that they wanted a big shed, and they didn't want a Hook Park big shed. They wanted a straightforward rural shed that they could use as their machinery store. So what we looked at was the materials that they were taking out, their own timber, and what they had was the best timber, the biggest pieces of timber that we had ever seen in some ways. I mean, and we were able, because these materials didn't need to travel, to use these enormous pieces of timber in their full lengths. And of course, these timbers didn't have to travel. And because they didn't have to travel and couldn't travel, we couldn't mill them. So Charlie set up a hewing workshop to hew these pieces of timber down. And we were interested in doing a piece of work that tied in with the Carpenters Fellowship program for trainee carpenters to do heavy carpentry. And so this is one of those workshops where people came and worked on these frames that were post and beam frame with, if you look at that bottom chord, that's 20 odd meters long, which I think is the biggest pieces of timber ever used in construction in their single pieces there. So you can see the scale of a person in the middle of that truss that were then lifted into place and made these buildings. And what I kind of enjoy about these buildings is, you know, my father is eternally disappointed with these buildings because they don't titillate him in the way that the big shed did. But when I look at these buildings, I like them because there's almost no architecture. It isn't an architect trying to think of a shape and make a shape. It just is the kind of backbone of a place where you don't really know where this is a shed that somebody has designed or a shed that has just evolved over many years. And some of the best buildings that I know sit on that kind of fine line between being architecture and not really being architecture. And I've always resisted buildings that are sort of pieces of architecture that we're supposed to come to as pieces of architecture and supposed to sort of place in the canon of architecture. And these are just simple little direct sheds that sit calmly and quietly along other kind of rural infrastructure that is made in a very simple way by non-specialist people. So the second little building we made there was this little mess room, and that was made out of smaller sections of timber, oak they had lying around. Again, I think there was something like 300 volunteer days that went into making of this building. And what we tried to set out with for this agency, the Forestry Commission, was just saying you could use your own material, your own people, and you can make your own buildings like this. You don't have to go and buy a steel frame shed. You can just use your material. You can look at it. You can use it intelligently. And these will act as a kind of roadmap for these type of places up and down the country. I'm going to run through this very quickly because I did want to touch on the urban context if I had a minute. And Charlie and I have gone back now, and we're working on another building there, which is hopefully starting on site next year, where we're working with a group of people at Weston Burt who have severe learning difficulties. And what we're really going between in this case is a way of using analog making to understand formally what this building can be. So this is analog making with people on site at Weston Burt, making by hand, and then scanning that in, and then using digital models to understand structurally how we can make that, and then testing those ideas through drawing, testing those ideas again through physically making on site. So what we went through the process of doing then was printing out digitally a set of pieces of paper, templates that we could make, tests that we could make every single piece of these buildings with people, regardless of their level of skill, regardless of the level of learning difficulties. And this was a very quick prototype that we made, again, on site, understanding a kind of system of construction before we went back and we redrew it, rescanned it, reimagined it, remade a model then with the same group of people to understand what the final finished piece would be. Thomas looks as if he's about to tell me to move on. I'm going to carry on if I can, just to touch on the urban.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
Okay. So I think I'm going to try and get through to the end of this. This is again the final iteration of that model that will now be scanned in again. I have over here in the studio to use to define this again. This is the final piece that we'll make next year. I've sort of gone through that slightly too quickly. Finally, to sum up, what I want to touch on is the urban context, because this is a place that is really interesting. And for me, we do make in different ways here. And this is an area in Bristol where instead of making with bits of timber, you know, there kit apart. Their forest is, kind of bricks and mortar. And we were asked here to make a little art studio for a group of people in the most deprived parts of the southwest of the United Kingdom. And, this is their vernacular. And of course, what do you make in this vernacular that is part of the fabric of this place? And how can you just use concrete blocks and blue EPDM and Velux windows to make something that will in effect inspire people? And what worries me about this place was that I had a conversation with an architect who had worked before me in this place on sending local makers bankrupt because they were too stupid and too unskilled to learn the way that he wanted to make something with his absurd shadow gaps and his kind of rarefied sense of material. So we said, why don't we just make something out of materials that they know how to use, that they can get from their local builders merchants, and then we'll unfinish it. We won't finish anything. We'll invite people through the patina of what they bring to it to make the finishes for this building. So this is room 13 here. We made it about 15 years ago, and it's all unfinished materials, which means over time, the life of the building has been played out and finishes this building. Every day it changes, every year it changes and gets better and better and better as it receives the life of the people that move on to this. The last project that I'm just very quickly going to touch on is, for me, what do you do when you want to upscale that? Do you carry on working as we do with this kind of absurd architectural wet dream that if we try and go to the other side of architecture, we can still pretend we're not in the mainstream, but still have our work judged as if we're going to win the Sterling Prize? So this was a project that I got about 5 or 6, 7 years ago, which is a public building that received £7 million of public funding in the southwest of the United Kingdom. And I went through a kind of process of bereavement in this project because I got planning for this project, designed this project, spent 5 years of my life on this project, to have it taken away from me because the organization that I am part of and put together with Meredith Bowles from Mole Architects, who's been the executive architect for many extraordinary architects around the world, was considered too risky to deliver this building, despite the fact that we're delivering buildings that are far bigger than this. And it was given to a local executive architect who supposedly tells me we're collaborating. But either way, what's really interesting about this project is, on one hand, I've gone through an incredible bereavement in thinking that I can't guide, shape, style this building as I want now that it is on site. But at the same time, I realized that I'm guilty of perpetuating this idea that I can carry on doing what I was doing. But actually, what's been the most extraordinary transformative thing now is realizing that I can abandon this thing and other people can take it over. Other people can weave their own process into it. If I really believe this idea about weaving in other people to this whole thing that we call making, then I have to operate in a different way. And I can't start judging these types of buildings in the same way that I would a Barcelona pavilion. And of course, the building was designed in the first place with this idea that as people used it, as people start inhabiting it, occupying it, taking over, making within it, it would become this thing that moved on from something that I could pre-imagine. So why did I mind so much that when it was on site, an executive architect was making decisions without me? So one of the most liberating things now has been to say, I've done what I can, moved on, other people, and it's not my building, it's someone else's building, but it's also part of me, and that's really exciting. And finally, one word on this, or a few words. This is my new plan for empowered making that is effectively the end product of my PhD that we can chat about later. That is a sort of rethought RABA plan of work where designing and making happen in parallel. I'm going to stop there. Thanks, Thomas.
Oh, thanks, Piers. I think this plan of works looks fascinating, and I'd really like to look into it. I mean, it's amazing the kind of this kind of successive series. Well, it seems like it's a kind of series of prototypes, and I also really relate to what you were saying at the end there about allowing buildings to have kind of other people to come into that process. We have a kind of a sister company that does custom build designs, and other architects and custom, and
because of course what we like about vernacular architecture. What we like about vernacular architecture is walking down the road and seeing the changes that have happened over time. And of course, buildings need to allow that.
Yeah, and you have to be ready to let go, as you say. There's a really nice comment in the chat here as well. I visited Westonbirt last month, and I think I spent more time looking at the buildings than the trees, which is a nice homage. I think I'll move on because we're running a little bit late, and then we'll come on to kind of discuss everything together at the end.